6 kitchens turned him toward the yard. The 7th set a plate down. He had knocked at 6 doors that week wearing another man's coat. She never asked his name. She pushed the salt across the table. 3 weeks later, he returned in his own coat, and she said nothing. 3 weeks later, he stood in the rectory doorway in his own bottle-green frock coat, cream waistcoat, black cravat, boots muddied to the ankle, and Margaret Ainsworth looked up from the boot in her lap, with the awl still in her hand. She had been driving waxed thread through the sole of the left one, the one already mended once, the cord at her waist swinging a little as she worked. 2 strands of dark chestnut hair had come loose at her temple, the way they always did by 10 in the morning. She looked at the coat. She looked at the man wearing it, and she did not stand up. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back up. Go back to a drawing room 40 miles east, where a fire was too hot and an old woman was counting months. Lady Augusta Calvert, Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne, sat perfectly upright in her chair, with the ivory-handled needlework hoop in her lap, and her chin lifted just enough to be insulting, and she told her son the arithmetic. The entail was written by a man dead 90 years, who had a horror of bachelors. If the Duke of Ashbourne was unmarried when the year turned, the estate, 11,000 acres, the mills at Cotterley, the London house on Bruton Street, 406 tenants, went sideways to a cousin in Shropshire who bred spaniels and had opinions about them. Not a threat, a clause. Clauses don't negotiate. Henry Calvert stood at the window with one hand behind his back, which is where that hand always went, and turned the heavy gold signet on his right little finger with his thumb, which is what that thumb always did, when he was deciding not to say the first thing he thought of. Here's the part nobody at those dinners understood. He wasn't afraid of marrying. He was afraid of being chosen. He'd watched it happen for 14 years, the softening of a face across a supper table, the instant somebody murmured, "That's Ashbourne." The way a mother's whole body changed angle. The daughters produced like sample books. He had never once in his adult life been looked at by a stranger who did not already know the number attached to him. 34 years old, and he'd never found out what his own company was worth without the title stapled to it. So he did something spectacularly stupid, which is often the same thing as brave. He went down to his own stables before 6 on a grey Tuesday and borrowed a greatcoat off a peg, heavy black wool, triple cape, dull horn buttons, smelling of horse and wet rope. Grey wool waistcoat, coarse cream shirt, brown breeches. He kept the boots because a man's boots are the one thing he can't fake, and told himself nobody looks at boots. People look at boots. He made a list of 7 names: country parsonages, small manors, the modest, respectable houses where a plain woman might live who had never seen the inside of Almack's. 7 doors. He would knock as a man with no name and see who answered him like a person. House 1. Bellingham Grange. A footman opened the door, took in the coat and pointed. Actually pointed with 2 fingers, the way you'd indicate a puddle, around the side. Not a word spoken. Henry walked the gravel to the yard and stood there 20 minutes before a boy brought him a cup of small beer and asked whose horses he drove. House 2. The Peverills. Here he got as far as the hall, where the lady of the house came out, looked at the greatcoat and said, brightly, to the air just above his left shoulder, "Kitchen door, my good man. We don't have people tramping through." My good man. 2 syllables of warmth wrapped around a shove. House 3 was the education. Mrs. Selina Harcourt, who had 4 unmarried daughters and the tactical instincts of a field marshal, kept him standing in the rain on her step for 6 full minutes, while she established, with genuine relish, that he had no card, no employer she recognized, and no business. Then she smiled, a real smile, the worst kind, and said, "You people always think the front is for you." And she shut the door with the sort of gentleness that costs more than a slam. He stood in the wet, counting the panels of that door and turning the ring on his finger, and understood, for the first time in his life, exactly what his tenants meant when they said, "It isn't the refusing, it's the way of it." 4 through 6 went colder. At Ferndown, he was left in a passage beside a bucket for half an hour and forgotten. At Little Sarum, a steward type in a starched collar asked him twice, patiently, whether he could read. At the 6th, a manor house with new sash windows and a lawn cut close as baize, he was not even asked a question. The maid opened the door, said, "Stable yard," and pointed with her chin. And here's the thing that got under his skin like a splinter and stayed there. Not one of them was cruel in the way a villain is cruel. Every last one of them was comfortable. They were doing the ordinary arithmetic of the county: coat, boots, accent, hands. Cheap wool goes to the yard. It was as automatic as breathing. And that was the horror of it. He rode out from the 6th house into a rainstorm that came sideways off the downs and soaked him through the Triple Cape in 11 minutes. The road ran to clay. His horse dropped to a walk. Somewhere in that grey, he stopped thinking about the entail and his mother's needlework hoop and the cousin with the spaniels, and started thinking about how a man learns what he actually is. The 7th name was at the bottom of the list, added almost as an afterthought in his own hand. Ainsworth. The rectory at Marbury. 12 miles. A parish worth £80 a year. A roof, he'd been told, by a man who found it funny, was cracked clean through above the West End. He turned the ring once with his thumb and rode toward it. The rectory kitchen door opens on a woman with her sleeves pinned back and an awl at her waist. She doesn't look up right away. That's the first thing worth noticing. A stranger in a borrowed black greatcoat with a triple cape and horn buttons stands, dripping, on her step, and Margaret Ainsworth finishes her stitch first, because you do not stop mid-stitch in waxed thread, unless you want a weak spot exactly where the water gets in. The boot is a man's boot, her father's, cracked along the vamp where the leather had gone dry and given up. She has it upside down across her knee, sole to the ceiling. 2 brass pins hold her sleeves above the elbow, forearms bare, a smear of beeswax dark along the side of one hand. Dark chestnut hair parted down the centre and pinned in a low knot, 2 strands loose at the temple, as always. The awl on its cord at her waist gets lifted, used, and set back down without her eyes leaving the leather. Here's how the stitch holds, since it matters later more than anyone in this kitchen knows. She punches each hole with the bone-handled awl first, angled, not straight through, angled, so the thread lies diagonal in the leather, and the pull of the foot never drags it back out the way it came. 2 needles, 1 thread, waxed until it's stiff enough to stand on its own. Each needle goes through the same hole from opposite sides, and the 2 loops cross inside the leather. If one side wears through, the other still locks. A saddler's stitch. It does not unravel. Cut it in 20 places and the 20 pieces still sit where you left them. That's her. That's the whole woman, right there, in a stitch. Now, the man on the step. An hour earlier, he'd been sent to a stable yard by a farmer who looked at the greatcoat, decided what he was worth, and jerked a thumb without speaking. 6 houses, 6 doors. One of them had actually said it out loud through a 2-inch gap in the voice people use for dogs and debt collectors. "We've nothing for your sort. Try further on and don't come back this way." 6 villages worth of contempt delivered patiently to a man who owned the ground under all 6. The 7th door opens all the way. Margaret looks at the rain behind him, at the mud to his ankles, and puts the boot down. She doesn't ask his name. She doesn't ask his business. She sets a second plate on the scrubbed table, like the plate had always been going there. Bread, a dish of salt, thin soup with barley gone soft in it, and a suggestion of mutton that had passed through the pot some days ago and left a note. In the corner, a pail. Above the pail, a stain on the ceiling the shape of whales, and from the centre of whales, water. 1 drop every 9 seconds or so. Nobody comments on it. It has been dripping for 4 winters. It is furniture now. Henry Calvert, Duke of Ashbourne, 34 years old, 6'2" of military straight spine, sits down at a rectory table and eats thin soup because a woman decided he needed it. His thumb finds the heavy gold signet on his right little finger and turns it. He has the sense not to let it show. She talks the way other people breathe, plainly. No hedging, no flourish, no arranging her sentences to see how they'll be received. "The roof will cost £30 to do properly," she says. "And slate is dearer than it was. The living is £48 a year. Her father is 68 and cannot climb a ladder, and the men who could would want paying. And there it is, 30 out of 48, and the 2 of them still expected to eat for the other 18. London is 40 miles off, which is 9 days for a letter to go and an answer to come, and the bishop's office has been sending the same reply for 3 years, which is no reply. She says all of it without once asking him to be sorry about it. And Ashbourne, who has spent a decade speaking in the careful, padded, 3-clause manner of a man whose every word gets repeated in drawing rooms, answers her simply. 4 words, flat, no ornament. He asks what she's mending. Not, "Might I inquire?" Not, "Forgive the intrusion." Just the question, the way you'd ask a neighbour. He hasn't spoken like that to anyone since before the title. She turns the boot over and shows him. The leather had been left wet and dried by the fire once, which is how you murder a boot. But the upper is sound, and the sole has 1 more life in it if the welt's restitched. Her mother's rule, she says. And then the refrain, said the way you'd say the date, not as wisdom, just as fact. Nothing is ruined until someone decides it is. The book comes off the shelf then. Her mother's, dead 5 years, a mending and receipt book, brown-covered, swollen with damp, hand-ruled columns, wax proportions, how to raise a nap on worn wool, what walnut hulls do to a stain that soap only spreads. 50 pages of a woman's brain, written down in a small, slanted hand, and on page 41, the hand simply stops, mid-line, mid-word, in the middle of a note about hare's foot and grease. Margaret keeps a pencil in it. She's been finishing the sentence for 5 years. He watches her hands. That's the whole of it, if you want the honest version. Not her face, though there's a birthmark low on her left jaw, shaped like a thumbprint, and a dimple that appears in the right cheek only when she concentrates, and he notices both. It's the hands, the awl, the angle, the thread pulled taut and never once yanked. Competence, with nobody important in the room. He stays longer than a man with a horse outside should. He leaves at dusk, without giving his name, and she goes back to the boot without mentioning him to her father. 3 weeks went by, and she told no one. Not her father, who sat by the window with his bent brass spectacle case in his breast pocket, squinting at sermons he'd already given twice. Not the Marbury women who came to her back door with worn-through boots and apologies about not being able to pay this month. She simply kept working. The awl on its cord at her waist, the 2 brass pins holding her sleeves above the elbow, her forearms bare and streaked to the wrist with the black of oiled leather. And across the lane at Ashbourne's home farm, a man in a borrowed coachman's greatcoat found reason after reason to cross a yard that had nothing in it. Here's what her work looked like by the end of that 3rd week. It had started as mending, a patch, a stitch, a boot brought back from the dead for a penny. Then re-soling, because a patched upper on a rotted sole is a joke, and she refused to hand back jokes. Then the thing nobody expected. She began building whole boots out of the estate's discarded hide. Understand what that leather was. Ashbourne's tannery had condemned a lot of 41 skins for water damage, blotched, hardened in patches, useless for saddlery because a saddle has to look like money. Nobody wanted it. It went to a heap behind the drying shed and stayed there through 2 winters. Margaret took it a barrowful at a time, and she learned what the tanner never bothered to learn. The damage was cosmetic in maybe 2/3 of every hide. She cut around it. She'd lay a skin flat on the kitchen table, run her palm across the grain, feel for the stiff, dead spots, and mark them with a bit of chalk. What was left she cut into soles, welts, counters, quarters. Ugly leather, sound leather. By the 11th boot, she was drawing her own patterns onto brown paper with the back of the awl, one for a broad foot and one for a narrow, and the dimple showed in her right cheek only, the way it did when she was concentrating hard enough to forget she had a face. Then boot 9 came back split. 9 days, that's all it lasted. Old Peggy Sowerby's right boot, sole parted from the welt across the ball of the foot, like a mouth opening. Margaret didn't argue and didn't excuse. She sat with it under the lamp for 2 hours, prizing the stitches apart, and she found it. She'd stitched the welt while the leather was still damp from shaping. Wet leather stretches. It dries, it shrinks, and the shrinking pulls every stitch hole into a slot instead of a hole, and the thread saws its own way out. Small noise, a soul splitting in a lane in Marbury. Catastrophic pattern, because every boot she'd made since midsummer had been stitched the same damp way, which meant 14 pairs were quietly counting down to the same failure on 14 pairs of feet that had nothing else to walk in. So she called them all back, every one. Free. She dried each welt 4 full days under a weighted board, waxed her thread heavier, and shortened her stitch from 8 to the inch to 11. 14 pairs, rebuilt, no charge, in 11 days. That's the whole method in one act. Find the fault, name it out loud, fix it, everywhere at once. Up at the great house, in a room where the fire was always too hot, a small, upright woman in plum silk with black lace at her cuffs looked up from an ivory-handled needlework hoop and said the thing she'd been saving. "Henry, you crossed that yard 4 times on Tuesday. There is nothing in that yard." Then Lady Augusta Calvert went back to her stitching, chin slightly lifted, having detonated her son from a seated position. He turned the heavy gold signet ring on his little finger and said nothing, which is its own confession. And while he said nothing, Mr. Edmund Fairley was already at work. Charcoal coat, small round steel-rimmed spectacles, the leather-bound rent ledger tucked under one arm like a weapon he'd never need to draw. He'd opened correspondence with the Hallam family of Ferncross. 30,000, a clean name, a daughter of impeccable dullness. Fairley called it securing the estate's continuity. He'd also, that same week, been asked about the leather heap by a curate's daughter, and he'd answered her at the estate office door without looking up from his ledger. "That refuse is estate property. You may be permitted to remove it, since burning it costs us 15 shillings. Do try to remember that permission is not the same as entitlement, Miss Ainsworth. Cobbling is a trade. You are a clergyman's daughter, with debts and no husband, playing at one. Nobody of consequence will ever put your work on their foot." He said it pleasantly. That's the part that ought to make your jaw ache. She said, "I'll need it in writing." He gave it to her, smirking, because he thought a signed line about rubbish was a joke. He'd signed away 41 hides, and every hide after. Then came the day Henry Calvert rode down to Marbury in his own coat. The household didn't know why. The grooms noticed the bottle green frock coat, the cream silk waistcoat, the black cravat, the tall boots already mud to the ankle before he'd cleared the gate, and they exchanged the look servants exchange when a duke goes somewhere no duke goes. The kitchen door stood open to the afternoon. Margaret was at the table with the 14th rebuilt boot upside down between her knees, sleeves pinned, the loose strands at her temples stuck to her skin, the faint thumbprint birthmark low on her left jaw catching the light. She heard the horse. She heard a step she already knew, and looked up. Blue-grey eyes, the freckle beneath the right eye, the thumb going to the signet ring. She did not curtsy. She did not gasp. Her father dozed 6 feet away and never stirred. She looked at him, and she said nothing at all to the room. She put the kettle on because that was what you did, and because her hands wanted something to hold. The rectory kitchen smelled of walnut hulls and cold ash. He sat down in the chair by the fire. The same chair, the exact same chair, worn shiny at the arms, where a coachman in a borrowed greatcoat with dull horn buttons had sat 11 times and drunk weak tea and said almost nothing. Now the coat was bottle green and tailored and worth more than the roof over both their heads, and he still sat like the coachman, elbows on his knees, boots muddy to the ankle, the gold signet on his right little finger turning slow under his thumb. Margaret set the cup down at his elbow, sleeves still pinned back above the elbow with the 2 brass pins, forearms bare and brown to the wrist with tannin that no soap on earth was taking off. "Your Grace," she said, "the hides at my gate come from your tannery." That's it. That's the whole detonation. No trembling, no accusation, no speech. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he looked at his own hands like they belonged to someone he'd just been introduced to. Here's the thing about a man who owns 11,000 acres. He does not know what happens on them. He knows the rent roll. He knows the tenancy map. He does not know that 4 miles east of the great house, behind the beech coppice, a tannery has been running since his grandfather's time, and that every autumn it takes in the hides off the estate's own slaughter, and every autumn it declares a portion of them ruined, scorched in the pit, overlimed, split wrong, wrinkled at the neck, and burns them. 300 hides a year. Burned. Because burning is tidier than accounting for them, and because the man who signs the tannery return also signs the estate return, and it is remarkable how much waste a smile can cover. 300 hides, Ashbourne's own leather, carted 3 miles and dumped at the rectory gate for the parson's daughter to clear off the parish road at her own expense, because a rectory gate is nobody's problem. She had been salvaging nearly 2/3 of it, 200 hides a year out of a fire. She told him the number plainly, the way she'd tell him the time. Then she took him out to the shed to show him why. Because Margaret Ainsworth has never once in her life explained anything with words when she could explain it with her hands. The shed smelled of vinegar sharp enough to sting the back of the throat, and under it the sweet rot of walnut hull. 12 pails along the wall. She lifted a scorched half-hide off the trestle, hard and dark at one edge where the lime had bitten too deep, and she pressed her thumb into the good part, and the leather gave, and pressed into the scorched part, and it did not. Her grandmother's receipt book lay open on the bench under a stone, the hand slanting hard to the right, and the line she'd read 900 times. Nothing is ruined until someone has decided it is. He read it standing there with his hat in his hand. Then he offered her the easy path. And to be fair to the man, he offered it clumsily, which is how you know he meant it kindly. A position in the household. Rooms. A stipend of £60 a year, and the tannery waste delivered clean and sorted and hers to work with, under the estate's name, an arrangement quite regular, nothing improper. "No," she said. One syllable. The fire ticked. He turned the ring twice and did not ask again. And that right there, is the moment the man was finished. Though he'd need 4 more months to notice, because the work was not his to house, and the very next batch went to hell anyway. 11 hides, pit-scorched worse than she'd read them, and she committed the whole lot to a walnut liquor she'd made too hot and too strong. Here's what a stain actually does. It does not sit on leather. It goes into it, into the fibre, and heat opens that fibre like a door. Too hot, and the colour races in unevenly and locks where the grain is thin. Too much vinegar, and the acid tightens the surface before the dye is through, and you get a skin that's black at the edges and streaked ochre through the middle. And it is dead. She lost 11 hides in one afternoon. She sat on the floor of the shed until the light went and did not cry. And then she wrote the temperature down. The fix was patience. Cold liquor. 4 days instead of 1. Vinegar in at the end, not the beginning, to set what had already gone in, not to bar the door before it. The next batch came out an even walnut brown you could not tell from prime hide unless you knew the neck wrinkle to look for. The county had laughed for 2 seasons. Then it stopped laughing and started whispering, which is worse and means you're winning. Then, in March, a bootmaker in Bath, a man named Pruitt, who had never heard her name and never asked her father's profession, sent an order for 20 pairs worth of upper leather at 9 shillings the hide, cash on delivery, and asked whether she could do 40 by Michaelmas. £9. Off a fire. Word of that reached the estate office in under a fortnight, and Edmund Fairley came down the rectory lane on a wet Tuesday morning with his rent ledger under one arm and his little steel-rimmed spectacles beaded with drizzle, chin tucked, small, measured steps, all patience and pity. He did not sit. He looked at her stained forearms the way you'd look at something on your shoe. "Miss Ainsworth, you are a clergyman's daughter playing at trade with property that has never once been yours. His Grace is charitable. I am accountable. £40 today, and the carting stops, and you go back to being what you are." He said it smiling, and he laid the ledger on the table like a closing door. "That is not for sale. I'll need it in writing." 8 words, and Edmund Fairley's smile stayed exactly where it was, which is the tell with men like him. He tucked his chin, folded his hands, and set the rent ledger back under his arm like a shield. £40. He'd said the number twice, slowly, the way you'd say it to a dog. Then he said the other thing, on his way out, hat already in hand. "Miss Ainsworth, your father is ill, and you are a curiosity. Curiosities do not eat. Take the money, and be grateful anyone thought of you at all." He said it kindly. That's the part that should make your jaw tighten. The rain came in that night off the ridge and stayed for 11 hours. She let the grate go cold because there were 4 scuttles of coal left, and the doctor from Marchford wanted 6 shillings a visit. Her father slept badly in the room above, that thin, wet cough coming through the boards every quarter hour. His bent brass spectacle case set on the table beside the bed where he could reach it, and never did. And Margaret sat in the kitchen, with the awl on its cord against her hip, and did the arithmetic she had been refusing to do for 2 seasons. £40 cleared the doctor. £40 bought coal into March. £40 meant she would never again come home with her forearms stained to the elbow and her boots wet through, the mended one letting water in at the seam. 2 loose strands at her temple, wet from the walk back from the shed. Grey-green eyes on a cold grate. If you have ever sat at a table at 2 in the morning and felt the easy road put its hand on your shoulder, this is that hour. She got up. Not dramatically. She went to the shelf and took down her mother's receipt book, the one with the cracked spine and the pressed sprig of tansy at page 40, and she opened it where it always fell open. Half a page of instruction for setting a walnut ground on wool. Then the hand stops. Mid-line. Mid-word, actually. A downstroke that trails off and never comes back, because the woman writing it put down the pen that afternoon and did not pick it up again. Above it, in the same brown ink, the sentence Margaret had been raised on. "Nothing is ruined until someone decides it is." She read it 4 times. Then she banked what coal there was and slept 3 hours. And at first light she was in the dye shed with the vinegar and the walnut liquor and the 41 hanks of Ashbourne's short staple that nobody in the county had wanted. The county changed its mind in stages, the way counties do. First came a man from Spitalfields with a soft London voice and a card that said he represented 4 looms in Wilkes Street. He'd been sent by a mercer, who'd been sent by a glove cutter, and he wanted to see the shed, not the parlour. He turned a skein in the light for a full minute, tested the twist with his thumbnail, and asked what she'd charge for £100 weight of it, dyed to that exact brown. She named a figure. He didn't blink. He wrote it down. Then came the letter with no name on it. A Viscountess's housekeeper, London postmark, 9 days on the road, asking for gloves in the walnut ground, for a lady who would not say where she got them and did not intend to start. 11 pairs. Then 19. By the second week of the month, the order book on the shed windowsill had 41 pairs against it, and Margaret had hired 2 women from Lower Wycombe to full and press at 8 shillings the week each, paid Saturdays, in coin, in writing. Ashbourne noticed. Ashbourne always notices last and loudest. The dinner was for a Miss Charlotte Devereux of Kent, 4,000 a year, a mother with excellent teeth, and an understanding that had been drifting toward Henry Calvert since he was 19. He performed it beautifully. Dark bottle-green frock coat, black cravat, one hand behind his back at the long window, saying the correct things at the correct intervals to 17 people who had all agreed in advance what the evening meant. And then Margaret came up the yard past the window, with 2 brass pins holding her sleeves back above the elbow, forearms bare, apron soaked at the hem, carrying a bucket in each hand at 9:30 at night. He stopped mid-sentence. Not dramatically, just stopped for 3 seconds, with a soup spoon in the air and a room full of people watching him look at a woman carrying water. The signet ring went round once on his little finger, then he finished the sentence, and it was a worse sentence than the one he'd started. The dowager did not look up from her ivory-handled hoop. She set 1 stitch, chin lifted, pale grey eyes on the linen, and spoke to no one in particular. "He has never once asked after the dye shed. Now he knows the hours the vat is hot." Then she took another stitch, and the silence went on for 11 seconds, and Miss Devereux's mother developed a sudden interest in the fish. He came the next evening, not on horseback, not announced, just standing in the shed doorway in his own coat, boots mud to the ankle, while Margaret lifted a hank out of the walnut and watched the colour come up true for the 9th time running. Margaret, not Miss Ainsworth. I have spent 34 years being the Duke of Ashbourne because no one asked me whether I wanted to be. My steward offered you £40 to disappear. He did it in my name. I did not stop him because I did not know. And that is worse. He turned the ring once and let go of it. I would rather stand in this doorway than in any room in that house. That is the whole of it. It costs me everything to say. She set the hank on the rail and wiped her hands and looked at him straight. Then say it where Fairley can hear. The deed came 3 days later, and it was not a romantic document. It was 4 pages of law clerk copperplate on the library table, where the fire is always too hot. And it stripped out of Henry Calvert's life exactly what he had spent 34 years being told was the point of him. The vein match, dissolved by mutual consent. Mutual, meaning the Vanes kept the settlement and Ashbourne ate the cost. £11,000 of promised marriage portion, gone. The Hertfordshire holding that would have come with it, gone. 2 seats at 3 tables in London that would no longer be laid for him, and a mother in Bath who wrote to say she was praying for his soul in the tone women use when they mean his estate. Fairley stood at the end of the table, with his rent ledger clamped under one arm and one hand over his mouth, which was the closest that man ever came to screaming. He had spent 4 years protecting Ashbourne's interest with a smile on. He'd been the one who signed the order to burn the tannery offal, 140 hides a season, condemned, carted to the pit, and fired because the estate's books called them a liability. He'd been the one who told her, in that patient little voice, that a parson's daughter, with dye to the elbow, ought to be grateful anyone let her cart rubbish off ducal land at all. His exact words, that first winter, in the yard, with 3 men listening. You're carrying away refuse, Miss Ainsworth. Don't confuse it with a trade. Girls like you don't have trades. You have a father who indulges you. He never apologized for that. Not once. Watch what happens instead. The Dowager Duchess sat by the window through the entire reading, with her ivory-handled hoop in her lap, chin lifted, pale grey eyes going from the deed to her son to the steward's white knuckles. When the clerk finished, she pulled her thread through, snipped it, and said the only thing anyone in that room said out loud. "Edmund, you look as though someone has taken your ledger and taught it to walk." Then she went back to her needlework. They married in July, in the church at Little Ashbourne, where the stone holds the cold in so hard you can see your breath at noon in high summer. No crowd. 14 people. Reverend Thomas Ainsworth performed it himself, in the black wool coat gone green at the elbows, and his hands shook so badly on the book that he lost his place twice, and had to fetch the bent brass spectacle case out of his breast pocket and start again. And nobody minded. And Margie stood there, straight-backed, in a slate-blue gown, with the bone-handled awl still on its cord at her waist, because she had come from the shed that morning and would go back to it that afternoon. 2 strands loose at her temple. The thumbprint birthmark low on her left jaw, catching the cold light off the stone. Henry turned the signet ring on his little finger once, and then took it off, and then put it back, and said his vows to her the way he had started speaking to her sometime around the 3rd ruined dye-lot, plainly, like a man with nothing left to hold back. Now, the part everyone wants. 4 years on, the shed behind the old tan pits employed 40 people. Not 40 as a figure of speech. 40 on a wage book, 28 of them women, paid 9 shillings a week, rising to 14 at the bench. The Ashbourne hides stopped going to the pit entirely. Every one of them came to her, bark-tanned 12 months in oak liquor, curried with cod oil and tallow, and the ones the estate used to call waste, the necks, the bellies, the scarred flanks, went into welted shoes and harness that outlasted anything sold out of Northampton. She had worked out on her own, over 2 seasons of failure, that a hide the trade called ruined was only a hide with an uneven grain, and an uneven grain is nothing if you cut around it and let the stitch do the arguing. 1,400 pairs a year. 19 months waiting list. A London order book with 2 viscountesses in it who would not name their source, and a Bath saddler who begged for an allocation in writing. And in the spring of the 5th year, Edmund Fairley walked down the lane to the shed door with his hat in his hand and his ledger nowhere in sight. And he did not apologize, because men like that never do. He stood at the bench where she was cutting, spectacles fogging in the tannery damp, and he asked, quite politely, whether the estate might place an order for 80 pairs of stable boots. He used the word madam. He asked what her terms were. She didn't gloat. She looked up, kept her hand on the knife, and said, "I'll need it in writing." That is what winning sounds like. It sounds like paperwork. She never spoke about the years he laughed. She just kept the shed running, and eventually the county caught up. 3 tanneries in 40 miles stopped burning their offcuts. A mill at Deeping started carting theirs to her gate, and the men who had called it a girl's hobby began calling it, without ever admitting the switch, the Ashbourne method. Years on a wet Tuesday, there was a young woman at the 3rd bench, with her sleeves pinned back above the elbow with 2 brass pins, because she had copied that from someone without noticing. And Margie stood over her, thumb stained dark, teaching her to run a welt. Awl first, angled out, thread waxed, pull both ends against each other so the stitch locks itself and never trusts a knot. A stranger stood at the gate that evening, hungry, carrying a sack of somebody's condemned scraps, sure she'd be turned off. Margie set down a second plate without asking her name. Then she said the thing her father's dead sister had written in a ledger nobody wanted. Nothing is ruined until someone decides it is. Henry watched from the window, one hand behind his back, ring turning. Come look at what your county throws away.